Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mustafa Yar Hiraj, and it is my distinct honor to be serving as president of the LSESU Pakistan Development Society. Um, this is panel number 2 for the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020, and the subject of today's discussion is foreign policy. Without further delay, I am now pleased to introduce our second panel, and this panel will deliberate on the implications of the future relations between Pakistan and the United States. How will a Biden-Harris administration influence the Indian occupation of Kashmir and the Afghan peace process? To discuss this, I am delighted to welcome our speakers, all of whom are very experienced individuals. I would like to thank all of you individually for attending the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020. Our first speaker for the foreign policy panel is the 27th president of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, Sardar Masood Khan, who is also a former diplomat and a foreign policy expert. Sardar Masood Khan joined the Foreign Service of Pakistan back in 1980 and has been posted on several diplomatic missions around the world. He served as the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2003, after which he became Pakistan's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations and international organizations in Geneva, Switzerland, from 2005 to 2008. Afterwards, he was assigned the portfolio of ambassador to China from 2008 to 2012. Sardar Masood Khan also had the opportunity of serving as Pakistan's permanent representative to the UN in New York from 2012 to 2015, and even headed the Institute of Strategic Studies as its Director General before he became president of Azad Jammu and Kashmir. It is an honor to host President Sardar Masood Khan at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020, and we believe that his diplomatic expertise, as well as his current position as a representative of Kashmir, make him a perfect fit for our panel. Our second speaker, Ms. Hina Rabbani Khar, who is a stalwart PPP politician and has previously served as Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs, being the youngest person and the first woman to occupy this esteemed office. After completing her bachelor's degree from LUMS and an MSc from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, she was first elected to the National Assembly in 2002. Under the Shaukat Aziz's government, Ms. Khar was first appointed Parliamentary Secretary and later Minister of State for Economic Affairs. At the end of 2007, she switched political affiliations and joined the PPP. As part of the federal government, she was assigned the portfolios of Minister of State for Finance and has had the distinct honor of being the first woman politician to present the Pakistani budget in the National Assembly. In 2011, she then became Minister for Foreign Affairs and played a vital role in easing up the tensions between the United States and Pakistan in the aftermath of the Memogate scandal. Currently, she is a key opposition member and is often seen to be quite vocal in parliamentary sessions. We are delighted to host Ms. Hina Rabbani Khar at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020, since her vast experience is sure to add value to our foreign policy panel. Introducing our final speaker on the foreign policy panel, Mr. Najam Sethi, a senior journalist, the former primetime TV show host of Aapas Ki Baat, and the co-founder of two of Pakistan's leading news weekly papers, Daily Times of Pakistan and the Friday Times, which is famous for its foreign policy section. Mr. Najam Sethi's contributions to the Pakistani society are numerous. He has worked for the rights of Balochistan, marched in the country's first Aurat March against the dictatorship of General Zia, and has always been steadfast in face of political oppression. Having won the International Press Freedom Award of the US-based Committee to Protect Journalists, as well as the 2009 World Association of Newspapers Golden Pen of Freedom Award, his journalistic ethic has received praise both at the local as well as the international levels. Mr. Najam Sethi has also served as the caretaker Chief Minister of Punjab in 2013 and has played his part in welcoming the return of international cricket to Pakistan, serving as Chairman Pakistan Cricket Board and head of the Pakistan Super League. We are delighted to host Mr. Najam Sethi at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020 and are confident that his presence will bring multiple foreign policy perspectives to the table and contribute to a very healthy discussion. I would now like to introduce Hamza Butt, who will be moderating our foreign policy discussion. Hamza Butt is a policy entrepreneur working on and advocating for sustainable development for the world's largest environmental conservation organization, the WWF. His interest in discourse, debate, and activism stems back to his school days in Islamabad, where he played an integral part in mainstreaming the public speaking culture and later founded the Islamabad Debating and Model UN Society. He completed his postgraduate studies in development policy from Cardiff University, on the prestigious Chevening Scholarship. As a Chevening Scholar, he presented the case of Pakistan at several forums of note, including the royal family at the Buckingham Palace, as well as the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. With that said, I think we should not keep you all waiting any longer for this panel to begin. So let's get right to it. Over to you, Hamza.
Thank you, Mustafa, for the introduction, and I'm pleased to be a part of this conference. I feel that platforms such as this are important for constructive discourse, and I hope that this panel would also have some very pragmatic ideas discussed. Today's panel discussion would be focusing on one of the most important events of the year 2020, which is the election of Joe Biden as the US president. Talking a little about the past of the Pakistan-US relationship. It has sort of depended on on broadly two factors. The first being that when did the US need Pakistan, and the second that how has Pakistan managed to take advantage and promote it in its interest when the US needed Pakistan. Uh, Biden's rise to power as the president may not drastically may not bring a drastic change in the US-Pak relationship and the dynamics, but it will surely present Pakistan with opportunities promote its strategic and economic interests with the US. Furthermore, in this discussion, we'll be also focusing on how the Biden presidency fits with the endeavors of the Naya Pakistan and how it may affect the future of Pakistan, which is the title subject of this conference. Um, Starting off, I will be inviting all the speakers. I will be opening the floor for discussion, and will be inviting all the speakers to give their opening statements, which would primarily be reflections and retrospections on how this government's performance has fared with the United States of America since 2018, and what has its diplomatic performance been. So I would like to start off with Ms. Hina Rabbani Khar, and would like to invite her to share her views on the subject.
Thank you. I mean, it's interesting because I could not help noticing that a session on foreign policy has been chosen to concentrate primarily on Pakistan's relation with the US. And that is somewhat the premise of some of the problems that I've had with how Pakistan has conducted her foreign policy over the years, over the decades. Because I genuinely believe that Pakistan's foreign policy dynamics have revolved too much around Washington, D.C. And as you were, or your colleague was opening his statement and talking about my tenure as foreign minister, he mentioned how, many things happened with the US at that time. And he mentioned Memogate as one of them. I would like to, talk about, for instance, Salala and how Pakistan had to actually cut NATO supply route to Afghanistan in reaction to 24 of our soldiers being dead. Also the OBL raid, etc. Despite all of that, I just want to bring home the point that during my tenure as foreign minister for 3 years, the US was not the highest on my agenda in terms of Pakistan's foreign policy management, simply for the reason that I genuinely believe that Pakistan's foreign policy obligations and Pakistan's dynamics and what Pakistan wants to achieve for its people through its foreign policy, because eventually, whether it's economic policy or foreign policy, eventually it has to deliver to the people. Whatever delivers to the people is good policy, whatever does not deliver to the people is bad policy. And as it happens, I genuinely believe that regional cohesion and dynamics and building, connectivity is what could have and should deliver to the people of Pakistan. But coming to the specific question of the Pakistan-US relations and how this government has handled it, look, I don't think this is unknown to any one of us in this panel or any one of us who do this regularly or look at this regularly, that the US has had a very different role in this region in the last 15 years. It has gone through what I would consider perhaps a sea change. Much of it can be, packaged and repackaged in very nice diplomatic words, but I would define it primarily as containment of China policy, right? And through that stems the, looking at India as the preserver of or the holder of order in this region, which has had many multidimensional problems, not only for a country like Pakistan and China, but pretty much for the entire region, because India's own credentials, as exposed through its handling of the Kashmir issue, more than anything else, and internally, what you see, the farmers' protest, everything else that is happening in India under Modi's India, is obviously not seen as a country which can be given the role of being the holder of order, itself being in a very, very disorderly state. So that has obviously had an impact on Pakistan-US relations in the last 15 or so years. The other overhanging impact has been from the Western Front. Their adventure in Afghanistan, and for that to have gone exceptionally wrong, has had a huge impact on Pakistan-US relations, simply for the reason that when everything was going wrong, the US papers, the US Congress, the US Senate, the US administration, starting from the last years of the Bush administration going into the early years, the last years of the two Obama terms, and certainly the first half of the Trump term, needed an entity to blame for the chaos in Afghanistan. And Pakistan presented, in some ways, an easy option. And much of our relations with US, fortunately or unfortunately, in the last decade or so, have been defined by what has been happening in Afghanistan. So the bilateral track has then been, in some ways, a corollary of what has happened in Afghanistan. With this government, obviously, that has shown itself by Pakistan really being able to go on or bring everyone around over years of effort by previous regimes also, in bringing everyone to the negotiating table, and to say that the real answer to this problem will only lie in negotiations. Now, the Trump administration, as we all know, wants to get out, has been wanting to get out at any cost, right? So I think that gave us a window of opportunity, a brief, perhaps not so brief window of opportunity. And at the tactical level, that has obviously improved relations in the last sort of few years. But going forward, when you look at how we view a Biden-Harris presidency as opposed to a Trump presidency, my answer to that is very simple. Look, the US policy, I won't use the words deep state for the US at all, but the US states policy do not change so much, or does not traditionally change so much with an administration going and coming, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic. It typically remains steadfast. However, in the person of Mr. Trump, we had interesting firsts that we have never experienced before, and one of them happened to be unpredictability. I mean, Mr. Trump could throw out a tweet about pulling out of Afghanistan on his own overnight, and everyone else, including his own administration, would have to deal with it. So that's certainly something that you will not see in a Biden administration. Also, you saw the US letting go of its role of being, in some ways, the policeman of the world in terms of human rights, in terms of democratic values. And on that front, I think Kashmir and what India did in Kashmir suffered a great deal under Trump, because we saw under Trump administration that they were not able to call out India's human rights abuse, as in other administration we hope will be able to do. So I feel that will be certainly a different track. And then I think one thing that all capitals of the world are very keen to look back at, or to start seeing in the future, is reliability, which is an extremely important aspect of any nation's conduct of its foreign policy. And when that seems to be the missing link in the conduct of the superpowers' foreign policy, it puts the entire world in some ways in a chaotic position. So I believe predictability and reliability are two factors that we can see, we can look forward to going back. I believe their focus on human rights, on democratic values, both within Pakistan, the whole Kashmir issue will be much more well attended. The human rights abuse in India will be much more well attended in a Biden administration. And going forward, I do believe, however, that their very close relations with India their very strategic relations with India at whatever cost will continue to go forward, because that's not US-India relations as much as, in my view at least, it is containment of China policy. And wherever I was going before the COVID crisis hit us, whether it was Munich or Brussels or London or any think tanks, it was very obvious and continues to be obvious that there's bipartisan fear of China, which is currently leading US policy. So I believe that will have an overhang, an impact on Pakistan-US relations, which will continue. And for Pakistan to play the balancing act between its relations with China and US is obviously exceptionally important. I believe it is entirely possible to do so because we have strong strategic ties with China, but that does not mean that we have to have bad ties with the US.
Thank you, Ms. Khar. I'll move on to President Sardar Masood Khan, and I will invite him to give his opening statement and specifically talk about the present government's performance and its relationship with the US since 2018, since their election.
Well, thank you so much. I think that this initiative that has been taken by Mr. Hiraj is commendable, and it is good to interact with the students because the young people in Pakistan constitute the bulk of our population. According to a survey that was conducted back in 2015, it was conducted by UNDP, 64% of Pakistani population is below the age of 30. So that is about 130 to 140 million people. And they have to deal with the United States now and in the years to come. So that's why this is a very important initiative, and I really appreciate it. Second, I think that the US-Pakistan relationship is very vital, and it has been so for the past 7 decades. It has had a cyclical pattern. In fact, at one point, we were called the most allied ally of the United States. And at one point, we were the most sanctioned nation against which United States Senate and House of Representatives slapped a series of sanctions. So, but we must recognize that this relationship is very, very important, whether or not we like it. So let me take you back to 2016 when President Trump was elected. At that time, from the point of view of the Democrats, there was some unfinished agenda vis-a-vis Pakistan and India. And there is some speculation whether or not the new administration, the new Democratic administration led by Mr. Biden, whether this administration would be the third Obama administration. My own view is there is going to be a new administration. It would have its own singular, unique fingerprint, and it would like to distinguish itself from the Obama administration, the two administrations that were led by President Obama. Now, what was the finished agenda? As a matter of fact, at that time, the United States, its negotiators and its high officials were breathing down our necks, saying that we should freeze our nuclear program, particularly short-range delivery vehicles and these tactical nuclear weapons. This was the agenda at that time. And otherwise, the formal talks, the so-called strategic dialogue between the United States and Pakistan had been suspended. There's another cluster of nuclear dialogue, which was called SSS and NP. This was also suspended. But the US diplomats were quite active on pressuring Pakistan to abandon its nuclear development, especially, as I mentioned, short-range delivery vehicles and tactical nuclear weapons. But of course, in 2016, again, I would say, between the Obama administration and the then government of Pakistan, there was huge misunderstanding in regard to Haqqani group or the role of the so-called militant organizations in Pakistan and their interference in Afghanistan's internal affairs and so on. And so these were the two items. Of course, when it came to Kashmir or other issues between India and Pakistan, the United States at that point chose to look the other way. So the reason I have given you this background is that we started, or the governments at that time started off with the Trump administration on a good note, as a matter of fact. I mean, because there was an engagement in the beginning, and that culminated in the meeting between the current Prime Minister and President Trump in Washington, D.C. And there were many surprises. Of course, there was a rapprochement at that time between the two sides. Before that, there was misunderstanding on a host of issues. But two surprises, of course. I mean, one was not a surprise that we came closer in regard to Afghanistan. And the second was that President Trump at that point offered mediation on Kashmir. And he said that he had been prompted by Narendra Modi to do so. Although when he made this claim, the following day, India's External Affairs Ministry rejected that statement of President Trump. And so later on, when President Trump talked about mediation, he equivocated, he tried to introduce an artificial balance between Pakistan and India. And so he was no good faith negotiator. Later on, it came very clear. It became very clear. So now let me tell you that in 2017, you'll have to go back to 2017, when President Trump had very angrily paused all assistance, security assistance to Pakistan. And the US propagandists, in fact, exaggerated the amount of assistance that had been given to Pakistan. In total, it was about $33 billion, out of which 18 billion were economic assistance in one form or the other. And the rest was the services rendered by our armed forces or the logistical support that we had given to the United States. That was, in fact, that amount was compensation for the services that we had rendered. So the task right now is for the Biden administration, our engagement with the Biden administration is to understand the Biden administration. Let me tell you that there are lots of expectations from the Biden administration. President Biden himself and Kamala Harris, they have given statements in support of the rights of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. They already, President Biden recognized the role Pakistan has played in the context of Afghanistan. The Trump administration recognized that, and now this new administration knows that without Pakistan's assistance and facilitation, Taliban would not have showed up on the negotiation tables. So that's a plus that we are starting with. But let me also tell you that we will have to reset our relationship, because for all practical purposes, the content of the relationship between Pakistan and the United States had been eviscerated, or it had been diluted during the Trump administration, and we had become Afghanistan specific state. So although in this current financial year 2020, some very minimal amount in the form of assistance has been allocated for Pakistan. Now, our expectations, you're talking about, I talked about that high watermark between the current government in Pakistan and President Trump, and that was the year 2019. And after that, we saw the developments in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir concerning these illicit, or first this invasion and occupation of the territory, then of course, illicit transfer of population and so on. So that mediation offer came to naught, came to nothingness. Now let me tell you that what should be our agenda. First is that right now the Indian Americans, the influential Indian Americans in the Democratic Party or in the civil services structure, they have all the academia, they've already encircled the Biden administration, and they have swamped it at various tiers. So that has to be understood clearly. We have to see whether Pakistani expatriates or Pakistani Americans have same sort of ingress into the Democratic power corridors or power hierarchy. They are also very active. I think they should be about 1 million Pakistani Americans. Ballpark figure, of course, some say that it's 700,000. Indians are 3 million to 4 million. Now, this is a very important factor, the diaspora community factor, because they influence decision-making that impinges on security of South Asia, directly or indirectly. Now, let me talk about Afghanistan. I think that President Trump is leaving behind a mess in Afghanistan. And so they have to, the Biden administration has to find a way to re-engage and to sort of minimize the losses that they would inherit. I think that Pakistan would remain a key player. But I would say that even after the pullout of the US troops, Pakistan would see turbulence in Afghanistan, and Pakistan has to be ready to deal with that kind of political turbulence and spill over to Pakistan's territory. So I won't say that this would be a repeat of the 1990s, but something akin to that is likely to happen. On Kashmir, of course, I mean, I'm only very cautious about it because yes, President Biden has made statements about Kashmir and about the rights of the Kashmiris. Kamala Harris very famously said that Kashmiris, you are not alone, we are with you. And such statements really reassured Kashmiris, and her remarks were applauded in Pakistan. But I would say at the same time that there are 2 or 3 possibilities. One, I mean, we can ask questions. Would President Biden or his designee, any of his designees, play the role of mediation? And I would rule that out because usually serving presidents do not act as mediators. Usually they do not. President Trump was very confident that he was past master in transactions and making deals, and therefore he could do that. But they could play a role in the Security Council because now that Pakistan has presented the issue of Jammu and Kashmir back to the Security Council, United Nations is a preeminent nation, and as a permanent member of the Security Council can play a pivotal role there. Second, would the United States intervene and dissuade India from killing Kashmiris, or I would say simply human beings there, because there's genocide taking place in Kashmir, and there's Lebensraum unfolding there, because in the past 4 months, the Indian occupation authorities have imported or transferred about 2.2 million people into the occupied territory. And this is an outrage, but nobody has called out India. Nobody who matters. I mean, of course, parliaments have been speaking up, but not the US government or others, for instance, other veto-wielding powers. So this is a crisis. My expectations are low at the moment, but I would say this would depend on our advocacy and our outreach. And this kind of outreach should not be confined to the government level. It should be, I mean, non-governmental sector should be involved in it, particularly civil society. And in regard to Kashmir, we should reach out to the US citizenry so that we turn this Kashmir movement into a civil rights movement. Let me briefly talk about that, you know, China would be a big factor between Pakistan and the United States. And somehow we have to tell the United States that our close cooperation with China is not detrimental to the United States. Easier said than done, because the Trump administration and their followers, they have whipped up this negative sentiment against China and against Pakistan because we are implementing the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So our agenda, as it was said by Ms. Hina Rabbani Khar, that our agenda should not be US specific, because Pakistan is a big country. Pakistan has a strategic location. Pakistan has multiple responsibilities. So what we should do is that we should conceive a holistic approach towards our foreign policy or national security, where multiple actors are available to us for consultation and for building relationships. So in that context, I mean, this China factor, which is one of the most crucial and sensitive subjects, has to be handled very skillfully. Our relations with United States should also be expanded to economic cooperation, educational sphere also, because our students are not getting admission in hardcore subjects like or basic sciences or natural sciences. And this is a huge deficit because, and India has an advantage because hundreds of thousands of Indian students are studying in the United States, and the United States still has the cutting edge technology. We mustn't forget that. In regard to the nuclear policy, I think that, you know, what has happened over the year, we must understand it very clearly, that because of the massive and effective penetration of Indian American leaders and politicians and civil servants and bankers and academics into the US system, now United States, by default and at times by design, does the bidding of New Delhi, India. And New Delhi's messages are conveyed to us via Washington, DC. Now, this is this is not fair because United States has started seeing Pakistan through the prism of New Delhi, and that complicates our relationship. Some people have asked whether we should get hyphenated again with India. I'd say there's no need of hyphenation. Pakistan is a big boy, is a big adult country, and therefore it should stand on its own and have direct engagement with the United States on merits. But in that context, if the new government restarts that process of giving entry to India in the nuclear suppliers group, we should resist it. And we had successfully done so till 2016. This whole process started during the Bush administration and culminated during the Obama presidency. And they were about to give formal entry to India in the nuclear suppliers group. If India enters in the nuclear suppliers group, that is curtains for Pakistan. So I mean, we should be very, very clear about that. Another subject which has to be dealt with very skillfully is Islamophobia. I call it this rising tide of anti-Islamism and anti-Muslimism. I mean, to be much more candid, Islam is nothing to be dreaded or feared, as the term Islamophobia suggests. Now, United States and its churches and its evangelists and its civil society, they can play a constructive role in promoting a dialogue between Islamic countries and the West. These are some of the stray thoughts that I have, and later on I can participate in the discussion, depending on the availability of time.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your input. And I would now invite Mr. Najam Sethi to give his opening statement, and I would request him to kindly critique these 2 years of the PTI government and how PM Khan has established this relationship with the US.
Thank you, Hamza. I think important issues have been raised so far, so I will stick to those. I'm not particularly interested in critiquing the last 2 years because I imagine the conference is about the way forward. And you have chosen to put the US-Pakistan relationship at the core of all issues. I wouldn't have done that, but I would have liked to have had a bigger spectrum of foreign policy issues to discuss. One of the reasons for that is that I think you put your finger on it when you started by saying that the US-Pak relationship has been based on needs, our need and their needs. But then from there, we went on to discuss why maybe Hina or maybe President Saab thinks that the US-Pak relationship is very important. I'm not sure of that at all, and I'll explain why. My sense is that if it is a question of need, which is what state interests are always about, regardless of any human rights considerations or any other considerations of a personal nature, maybe the grid between two leaders and so on and so forth, which I don't think amount to much when state interests are involved. But my sense is that if in the 1950s and 1960s, and indeed in the 1970s, until the Soviet Union fell apart, the US interest in Pakistan had to do with the Soviet Union. And we milked it for whatever it was worth as members of various alliances. And then the US interest waned after the Soviet Union collapsed. And the US walked out of Pakistan. Indeed, as President Masood may recall, the US went out of its way to roll back our nuclear program. I remember that very distinctly in the 90s. And it was a very hostile period when we were sanctioned and attempts were made to roll back our nuclear program. And that's exactly the time when, in fact, the Kashmiri struggle erupted indigenously, and then we decided to lend a helping hand for obvious reasons. But we got no support from the United States during that time for the Kashmir cause or for any other cause. And it wasn't until 9/11 happened that the US woke up and thought, well, we need Pakistan again. And the need was also buttressed by the threat, if you recall. We'll bomb you to the Stone Age if you don't help us, and so on. And so we lined up again, once again, as a faithful recipient of US aid and military and economic aid for trying to do their bidding. And President Musharraf played that game with the United States for as long as he could, but there were always tensions in it. And then during that time, when President Musharraf made a very important breakthrough, or at least tried to launch an enormously important initiative vis-a-vis Kashmir with India, although there was moral support from the United States, but the US did nothing to help us move that plate forward, as it were. And it's a great tragedy that that moment was lost to history, because much could have been accomplished at that time, things that we cannot even conceive of right now. But having said that, the US came back in a sense when it needed us in Afghanistan. The problem was, as Hina pointed out, that we weren't delivering. We weren't doing more for what the US interests were in Afghanistan. The US interests were to finish off the Taliban and to establish and to allow the establishment of pro-US governments in Afghanistan. The problem for us, of course, was that these so-called pro-US forces in Afghanistan were all pro-India. So we couldn't really deliver the American agenda. And I think that's where the tensions arose. Some issues have been pointed out. There were many other issues as well. And it was a tentative sort of a relationship. And what we got out of it was so-called coalition support in terms of some money, maybe $1 billion+ a year, and so on. But the United States throughout has been asking us to do more. And its irritation with us has been that we didn't do more in terms of their agenda. But of course, we were concerned about our agenda. And what was our agenda in Afghanistan? Our agenda in Afghanistan was that we wanted a friendly Afghanistan. We wanted an Afghanistan that was not pro-India, but pro-Pakistan. And for a long time, we in fact rejected the notion of a neutral Afghanistan. And our position was we want a friendly Afghanistan. And it's only in recent times that we have changed that position. And we have stopped saying that we want a friendly Pakistan. We would be happy if there is peace and stability in Afghanistan, and we have an arm and a leg in Afghanistan. And India is not given undue recognition or importance. But that's a long way from the situation that we face today. And I think that the fact that we abandoned our position on friendly Afghanistan and said, okay, we need to move in a different way now, has helped us to come closer to the United States, which is why President Trump, as you know, was very hostile to us. He said some very nasty things about us. And then when he decided that he wanted to pull out, and when we decided that we wanted to help find a solution in Afghanistan that would satisfy a broad spectrum of forces there, not necessarily all of which are friendly towards Pakistan. Some are very, very inclined to be very pro-India. The relationship began to gather some traction. But as you know, the traction that we would have wanted, we still haven't got it. The US may have got a little bit of it, but we haven't got any traction. We've got no economic assistance. We've got no military assistance. All we've got is two things, which are important right now, and which is what the US is leveraging. One, of course, is the IMF. The IMF wouldn't be here if the State Department wasn't telling the IMF to be here, number one. And number two, of course, is the FATF. I mean, those are the two levers the United States has on us, which they've been exercising from their point of view. We get no money from them. We get no support from them on Kashmir. We get nothing from them in actual fact. There's not even an initiative to open up some trade avenues for us. We've been asking for a lot of things on textiles and other things. Nothing, absolutely nothing. So I think my sense is that under Trump at least, the US was only interested in us to the point of helping us or getting us to help it get out of Afghanistan in an honorable position, and then work their way around it. And we have, of course, done that. We played a very important role in bringing the Taliban around to talks and to moving ahead on what happens in Afghanistan. But it is a long way to go. I mean, I don't want to go into that right now, but there is a long way to go. So my sense is that the American policy towards Pakistan, and before I come to the Pakistan policy or expectation of America, the American policy under Joe Biden will be towards Pakistan will be governed broadly by its policy towards China, its policy towards India, and its policy towards Afghanistan. The sum result of these policies will determine how America wants to look at Pakistan and what it will give to Pakistan or what it will expect of Pakistan and what sort of relationship that will be. There's been mention of the China issue. Yes, the containment policy is going to be very much in play. But that's good, as President Saab has pointed out, that is going to be a tricky area. I mean, I'll just give you one example of how tricky the Pakistan-China axis is going to be for India and also for the United States. Recently, the IMF asked the Pakistan government to show them the contracts which the Pakistan government in the Nawaz Sharif era had contracted with China on the various projects. The money that China has given us directly and indirectly. And there was, and we have given an understanding, we have an understanding with China that we will not disclose these agreements. That's a separate debate why, but that's what the Chinese. And we've ended up having to now show the Americans some of those agreements. And which is, of course, part of the American agenda here, that the Chinese, the footprint in Pakistan should be minimized, should be sabotaged, should be diminished. Whereas ours, of course, is that this is now the Pakistan-China friendship or relationship is of core value and interest to us, much, much more than the Pakistan-American relationship. So that's the one area where there are going to be problems. The second, of course, is that the American policy towards India. Yeah, there may be, because Joe Biden has a strong human rights dimension to his policies. Yes, I think there will be some talk between the United States and us and others at international forums as well about the human rights violations in India. But beyond that, I frankly don't expect the United States to do anything. I think what Narendra Modi has done is he's taken India on a path from which it will take a huge effort by India and by the international community to bring it back from this disastrous path that it has launched itself, which of course impinges on us, not just in terms of Pakistan-India tensions and Indian ambitions and threats to us, but also about what happens in Kashmir. And already what has happened in Kashmir. I mean, just imagine how difficult it will be to turn that decision regarding 370 back in a sense and move forward again from a position that existed before that. Seems very difficult to me. So yes, there will be criticism, but beyond that, I think what you have is a fait accompli in India, which makes our position even more difficult and problematic with India and with other countries that will not support us, in my view. India will remain, despite its current hiccups in terms of economic growth and all the rest of it, India will remain a big market for them. And India will remain the linchpin in this region of the anti-China policy. The Indian-American naval maneuvers and all the other agreements that are now taking place with are just a signpost to that. So my sense is that the first American policy towards China will impact on American policy towards Pakistan. Second, American policy towards India will impact on Pakistan. And thirdly, American policy in Afghanistan. I mean, what is happening right now? I mean, the international community is committing a couple of $1 billion a year to keep the Afghan government going. That's not going to be enough. It's only a matter of time, unless there is a huge international input into propping up the Afghan government.
I think we may have lost Mr. Sethi. Since we're running behind schedule, I will be intervening and I will be posing a next question to Ms. Khar, in which I would want your comment on how do you on the future of the park of on the Afghan peace process after Biden is sworn in, and what implications do you think would this might have in Pakistan? Also, a request that let's from this point onwards, let's just keep our answers as brief as possible because we're a little short on time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is the $1 million question as to what is going to happen in Afghanistan. And ever since I've grown up, or certainly for the last 20 years or so of my life, I don't think there are any easy answers. And there's a bit of, more of the same. But I genuinely believe that we are at an exceptionally important time where if we decide to go the right way, then yes, you will not be able to create a Switzerland in Afghanistan, but you will perhaps have a much more stable and perhaps peaceful and perhaps prosperous Afghanistan than you have seen in the last many decades. And the reason for that is very simple. Look, I think Mr. Sethi alluded to it, President Saab alluded to it. Afghanistan has been the playground of superpowers and great powers from centuries, perhaps, at least many, many decades, right? Now, I remember during even our time in office or every time we've dealt with Afghanistan, the problem is that everybody feels they have the solution for Afghanistan other than the Afghans. And that is why we take great pride in the fact, and I'm very proud of the fact, that Pakistan decided to drop the friendly from stable Afghanistan. Okay, if Pakistan is smart, Pakistan should seek a stable Afghanistan, which will naturally become friendly because it is in its interest and in our interest to remain friendly in order to deliver to the people of both Pakistan and Afghanistan. So going forward, I think it's exceptionally important that we all give exceptional importance to the intra-Afghan dialogue, for which the best news came just 2 days back, right? That you have the formalization of the intra-Afghan dialogue. There was a lot of chaos. We know that since Karzai days, the Taliban only wanted to speak to the US administration. So we've gone through that grind, we've gone through that process, and now the intra-Afghan dialogue has officially started in some ways, right? So I think this is a huge opportunity. Now, where are the spoilers? The spoiler is not going to be Pakistan, let me assure you of that, because I think if anything, Pakistan wants stability in Afghanistan at whatever cost, and even at the cost of slightly unfriendly, administration in Afghanistan. But I think the spoilers are most likely going to emanate from within Afghanistan, entities which are benefiting from the chaos which is in Afghanistan right now, entities which are currently benefiting from the fact that all of Afghan ethnicities are not very well represented in government, etc. So the spoiler alert from me is certainly going to be from within Afghanistan, and then perhaps I think our eastern neighbor is obviously not very happy with how the situation has unfolded in Afghanistan and wants to continue to have a role. The situation has changed a bit where Pakistan has receded from wanting to have a role. India has actually gone on the full throttle wanting to have a role in Afghanistan. I think Pakistan is quite comfortable with neither having a role in Afghanistan and Afghanistan being respected as a sovereign country. So I do not see Pakistan having, I see Pakistan hopefully only having a positive role. I believe the US is exceptionally keen to move out of Afghanistan. We just hope they do not leave a chaotic situation. And we hope that, this time around, the departure is more synchronized and leaves conditions which are stable and that do not make Afghanistan a threat to the Afghan people and to the entire region.
Thank you. I'll pose the same question to Mr. Sethi, and also please do mention if you agree or disagree with Ms. Khar on this, that on the future of the Afghan peace process and the implications that it might have for Pakistan. And I would request you to please be kindly brief. And after that, we'll be moving on to briefly discussing the Kashmir issue with the president. So you will have to unmute yourself. You are not audible. Sethi Saab, you will have to unmute yourself. You're not audible.
Yeah, sorry, I missed out on a bit of what Hina was saying because I went to fetch a glass of water. So can you just pose the question again, and I will be brief.
The future of the Afghan peace process and the implications it might have on Pakistan.
Yes, well, I'm being honest with you. I don't hold out much hope. Regardless of our best efforts and those of the United States to get some sort of stable arrangement going, I've always felt that it's not in the interests of the Taliban to share power. They have the staying power, they have the resources, they have the manpower, and unless the Americans and the international community put in $4 or $5 billion a year, which is very doubtful, to keep the army going, the Afghan army going, and Ghani and everybody else on their toes, my sense is that sooner rather than later, once the Americans pull out, if the Afghan government will collapse. And it's only a matter of time, maybe a year or two, before the Taliban will take over. I see no reason why the Taliban should settle for a peace agreement. Everything they have done to date has been to gain advantage and not to sign the peace agreement. And even now, after 2 years of running around and doing everything that Pakistan could have done, bringing them to the table and everything, where are we? The things that have just been announced are talking about the talks again, about the steps that need to be taken, and so on and so forth. I would have imagined all this would have been done a year ago at least. So I'm not optimistic at all. I think eventually civil war, this civil war will continue. I do not think there will be any stable arrangement. There are too many issues, constitutional, cultural, all the others. And I think sooner or later, the Taliban will take Kabul. And when they do, that is when they will establish relationship with the United States, with Pakistan, and with China. I think their most important relationship will be with China at that time, and for obvious reasons. And I think that's the time when Pakistan and China will play a very important role in Afghanistan. As long as the Ashraf Ghani and the Northern Alliance and all these guys are hanging around, the Taliban are not going to give in to them and go in for a long-term, stable relationship with them. There's no reason for them to. Of course, as I said, unless the international community continues to pour in money and the civil war continues. So in short, that's my view.
Thank you, Sethi Saab. Another issue that emanated from the opening statements of all the speakers was of the issue of Kashmir. Kashmir over the years and since 47 has been a strong determinant of the Pakistani foreign policy. And since the revocation of the Article 370, no strong voices have been raised globally for the cause of Kashmir. You have to give it to the VP Kamala Harris that she has been outspoken as far as the cause of Kashmir is concerned and the human rights violations that are happening at the hands of the Indian forces. I pose this question to President Khan that how do you think that this issue can be taken up with the Biden administration and made more effective? And using your experience from the UN, what solution should you think that Pakistan should be pushing for? A bilateral solution or a multilateral solution? And could you please be very brief about that, as we'll be moving to the Q&A session after this?
I'll be brief, but a couple of points that I want to make. First, vis-a-vis the United States, we should not be reactive, but proactive. By that, I mean that do we have an agenda on Kashmir that we want to put before the United States? Or do we expect the Biden administration to take initiative and tell us what to do on Kashmir? So I would suggest that in demonstrating adulthood, we should prepare our own brief, our own narrative, and engage the United States on Kashmir. What can be that agenda? That agenda is that the United States should intervene and stop India from committing genocide and crimes against humanity in the Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The United States is bound by international law, international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions. In fact, the United States considers itself to be the custodian of all these laws. So it has a responsibility, not only as a preeminent nation, but also as a member of the Security Council. Your second question, or second part of your question, is whether or not Pakistan would prefer a bilateral solution or a multilateral solution. Pakistan and the people of Jammu and Kashmir prefer a multilateral solution. We believe in multilateral diplomatic solution, a solution which was already handed some 7 decades ago by the United Nations in the form of a plebiscite to be held under the auspices of the United Nations. Some people would say that this is anachronistic, that this is something which happened in the past and these resolutions have not been implemented. But they are a starting point. They are a democratic solution. And Kashmiris are being punished for the past 7 decades because they want to exercise their political will. Now, that's why I would say that when we talk about multilateralism, we talk about the multilateral forums like the United Nations Security Council, also Human Rights Council. But I would also like to point out that we should project to the rest of the world that there are 3 parties to the dispute: Pakistan, India, and the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and that the people of Jammu and Kashmir are key constituent to this dispute. They are the ones who have to decide their future and destiny. And the United Nations is also associated because it was the one which handed down a dispensation, a judgment, which has yet to be implemented. So I would say that if there is mediation, I firmly believe, having been president of Azad Jammu and Kashmir for the past 4 years, that one of the reasons that we haven't found a solution to the Jammu and Kashmir dispute is that the representatives of Kashmir have never sat around the negotiating tables, whether they were multilateral negotiating tables or multilateral negotiating tables in Delhi or Islamabad or in New York. And, you know, United States, after all the opposition to the Taliban, sat with the these Taliban representatives face to face. They were considered pariah. Taliban were considered pariah, but still, when it came to a solution suiting the United States, they sat across the table with Taliban. So what I want to say is not a bilateral solution, because bilateral solution or bilateral engagement between India and Pakistan for the past many decades, starting from 1972, has been, as a matter of fact, a hoax, a mirage. And India has used it as an instrument of policy to buy time and to consolidate its occupation in the territory.
Thank you for your view, sir. We will be moving on to the Q&A right now. The first question that we have is from Ms. Hina Rabbani Khar from Sara Ahmed. The question is that should Pakistan follow its allies in the Middle East and recognize Israel? And would that significantly strengthen Pakistan's relationship with the US? You will need to unmute yourself, ma'am. You are on mute.
I mean, this is a very easy answer, right? Because I do not believe that countries should be thrown away on the basis of holding on to fallacious ideas which have no real, reality on ground. But Palestine is not one of them, is not one of those fictitious ideas, and neither is Kashmir one of those fictitious ideas. Okay, these ideas and these states and their people's right to self-determination is recognized by multilateral order that was created post-World War II. It has been recognized by all major countries. Right now, what you see is that, I talked about unpredictability of the Trump administration, right? So what you see is that the US obviously had an administration which was exceptionally pro-Netanyahu, pro-Israel. And it did what was unprecedented even from US standards. And you saw all of the Middle Eastern countries run or stand in line to its bidding, simply for the reason that the Middle Eastern countries, I feel, have been finding the US's attentions to be meandering away from them and towards other entities, because we all know the US is now not playing the type of role in the Middle East that it traditionally played, and looking more towards Asia Pacific. So all of these countries felt this was an opportunity to do US's bidding, and we know all the dynamics that worked to do this. Now, interestingly, in one of the dialogues that we had, which is sometimes, with important people, but off the record, I asked an exceptionally important person who happens to, was even part of the negotiations, etc., a few months before, as to how important is it for Israel that it is not recognized by Muslim countries. And you know what the answer was? The answer was, if there's anything Israel craves for, and if there's anything that holds it back, it is recognition from the Muslim states. So please do not underestimate the importance of what is happening. Okay, the recognition that it has gotten from some very important Muslim states is a very, very big step. And I do not believe, not for the sake of Kashmir, I think it is unthinkable of Pakistan to even do that. But I do not even go that far. I say for the sake of the moral values and the standards that Pakistan, hopefully internationally, still espouses to and stands for, there's no question of it. And anyone who thinks it possible must literally wring their hand off, ever wanting the world to stand behind you on the issue of Kashmir. Look, eventually, it's not about what you have achieved so far, okay? But are you on the right? And when people make interesting observations that this is, the same as what is happening in Balochistan or elsewhere, it's ridiculous. Internal matters are internal matters, but these are internationally recognized UN security resolution matters, okay? And unilaterally for countries to go and start recognizing who they wish is in some ways ridiculous. And I would never hope Pakistan would do a thing like that.
Sethi Saab, there has been talk in the media circles and there has been some advocacy for the recognition of Israel. A simple yes or no would do. Firstly, do you agree with some of your colleagues advocating the case of the recognition of Israel? And do you think that this would significantly strengthen Pakistan's relationship with the US, considering the strong tilt of the US towards Israel? You, sir, will have to unmute yourself. Sethi Saab, you are not audible. You will have to unmute yourself, please.
The military establishment has looked at various options in the past also, and the options did not mean only recognition. There can be contacts, there can be other ways of a relationship which doesn't lead to necessarily to or imply recognition in a formal sense. We know about the contacts during the Musharraf's regime and so on and so forth. And as Hina says, Israelis are very keen to woo the Muslim world over. Half their job, almost all their job would be done if that were to happen. So yes, there's been some interest in terms of what are the pros and cons and so on and so forth. And it's not as though this has just come out of the blue, this discussion today that we're having. But having said that, I think it's absolutely clear that the Kashmir issue and the Palestine issue, in a sense, as old, together they've grown up to become huge and bigger issues as time has gone on. And more people have been killed. The Israelis have been as ruthless and vicious as the Indians. And in a sense, both are issues of self-determination. It's not possible for Pakistan to abandon the cause of Palestine while it wants to still continue talking of the cause of Kashmiris. So unless there is a solution which is acceptable to the Palestinians, and of course that means an understanding with the Israelis, until that happens, there is no way Pakistan is in a position to recognize Israel. It's not even in a position to do the sort of things that some of the Arab states are doing right now, playing footsie with the Israelis. And of course, the Israelis are trying very hard. So I don't see that happening. And I don't see a Palestinian solution that is acceptable to the Palestinians happening in a year or two. I don't know, maybe Biden can bring some new plans to light, but I can't say. But so therefore, as far as I'm concerned, there's no question of Pakistan recognizing Israel.
Thank you. Do we have Mr. Zirak here? All right. Well, his Zirak has asked Mr. Najam Sethi, and he says that we see Pakistan depending too much on the CPEC for its development, like we depended on the USA solely during the 1960s. Do you think that greater economic ties with the USA would help mitigate this dependence?
Uh, we of course would like to have good ties with everyone, especially the United States. The question is not what we want. The question is, what does America want? Because we are the ones who want America to give us A, B, C, D, E. Help us on Kashmir, give us money, give us weapons, help us in our Afghan strategy, and so on and so forth. But as I said, I don't know, and I don't think the Americans are going to be too interested in scratching our backs the way we want our backs to be scratched. So having said that, I think the China-Pakistan relationship is really a very critical relationship now for us. And it's a little different from what the Pakistan-America relationship has been. The Chinese want this CPEC thing to work. They have made huge concessions for us. They will continue to make huge concessions for us. They are also very important. They are going to be very, very important in Afghanistan and Central Asia and other places. And of course, the Chinese are the ones that tilt the balance of the India-Pakistan equation in our favor. So I think the Chinese relationship is critical and of core value to us, not just economically, but diplomatically as well. And I don't need to go into it, how they help, how they continue to help us in the United Nations, how they help us with FATF, how they help us with bailing out the state bank, how they help us with money, how they help us with investments. I think there's going to be more rather than less. Unfortunately, there's been a hiatus of late. CPEC literally ground to a halt because this government was unclear about how to move ahead. And they were concerned that the Americans should not get too upset because they needed American support with the IMF and FATF. So the Chinese, my personal knowledge is that Chinese have been a little upset that we have put a halt on CPEC. And that had to do with all sorts of reasons. But now, we didn't even have an act of parliament. We're still running on ordinances in terms of who's going to run CPEC and how it's going to be run and so on and so forth. So I think there needs to be a revival of CPEC rather than the other way around. And CPEC is so many things to China and CPEC is so many things to us. So yes, I think the the Pakistan-China relationship is going to be, is expected to be of core significance and importance for us.
Thank you, Mr. Sethi. I'll be posing the next question to Sardar Masood Khan, sir, President Khan. Sir, what the question says that does the integration of Gilgit-Baltistan as a fifth province risk a further escalation of hostility in Kashmir? And how do you think can this risk be mitigated?
I don't foresee any escalation in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir or between Pakistan and India because of the envisaged developments in Gilgit-Baltistan. But let's try to understand what the people of Gilgit-Baltistan are saying. For years, they've been saying that they should be given a provincial status. They already have a chief minister, they have a governor, they fly the flag of Pakistan. And if you go to Gilgit-Baltistan, go to Gilgit and Skardu and meet people there from all political parties, they would tell you unanimously that they acceded to Pakistan back in 1947-48. And the instruments of accession that they sent to Pakistan have not yet been responded by the successive governments of Pakistan. The parties in Pakistan, political parties of Pakistan, are also unanimous about giving a provincial status to Gilgit-Baltistan. The parties in Azad Jammu and Kashmir, the political parties in Azad Jammu and Kashmir, and the all parties, Hurriyat Conference, the two representatives of Kashmiris in the Indian occupied territory, they have been counseling the people of Gilgit-Baltistan and also their leadership not to change its status because this might imperil the status of Kashmir in the United Nations. But the people of Gilgit-Baltistan are saying that they are as staunch Kashmiris as Kashmiris from Azad Kashmir and the occupied territory are. All they want, they say, is their full rights civil liberties, fundamental freedoms, constitutional rights, and integration with Pakistan. Right now on the agenda, although nothing has been cast in stone yet, right now on the agenda is a provisional province, not a constitutional province, which means that while it will have, Gilgit-Baltistan will have the trappings of a province, it would not be a full-fledged province, and therefore that international dimension of Gilgit-Baltistan status as part of the larger territory of Jammu and Kashmir would be kept intact. What I can foresee is that if this status is changed, there would be appropriate caveats and qualifications. For instance, saying that this territory or the people of this territory would be subject to a plebiscite or subject to a solution that would be decided by or implemented by the United Nations, or something to that effect. There would be a reference to the resolutions that are already there. So, but your question was not this, I just elaborated it. Your question was whether or not there's a risk of escalation. Escalation has already taken place. There are 900,000 troops deployed in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, and India's Defense Minister, Rajnath Singh, they have threatened to take back Azad Kashmir militarily, and they have also threatened Gilgit-Baltistan. They have also objected to the China-Pakistan economic corridor passing through Gilgit-Baltistan. So the escalation, the kind of escalation that you're talking about is already there. Would it turn into conflagration between the two neighbors at a conventional or strategic level? I'd rule that out for the time being, but the risk would remain there.
Thank you very much, sir. I'll be combining the next two questions from Ms. Hina Rabbani Khar. These are by Walker Young and Murtaza. It says that since you have personally dealt with the Biden and Obama administration, with Biden and the Obama administration in the past, do you think that the Biden administration will be another third Obama presidency? And do you think that the US will or has learned anything from its past adventures in Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan when it comes to regime change? And what are your thoughts on the Iran standoff? Those are three questions actually.
That's a lot of questions. Okay. So I'll try and be brief. Look, Biden was the team player in the Obama administration. So with a lot of respect for Mr. President, and of course, and he's one of the premier also sort of analysts and foreign service people. I do believe you will see a lot of Obama-ish tendencies in the Biden administration because having seen them, having read now interesting academic work on the Obama administration, I do feel the Biden administration. I also, however, do believe that I think from his selection of team, I'm very impressed, by the way, so far. Knowing some of those people that he's nominated as, perhaps Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, likely to be. These are people who are not very egotistical and who seem to be very serious players. So I'm quite, so if anything, they have a bigger challenge because they have to retake the global, status of the US that Trump so easily filtered away. JCPOA is a very good example of that. So is the climate change. The US stopped playing a leadership role in these areas. The whole world suffered because of that. So to reclaim that space, which is now obviously when you leave a vacuum, it will be claimed by other entities. And you see this fear of China, overwhelming fear of China, to be, frankly speaking, emerging from that particular vacuum. And interestingly, whoever wants to really understand where the US is, and this also answers the second part of the question, have they learned anything from Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan? My answer to that is no. A superpower typically does not tend to learn its lessons from history. However, my answer to that becomes a yes in terms of, are we likely to see more interventions? My answer to that is no. We are not likely to see more interventions in such states, not because the US has learned its lessons from history, but because the US's interests have shifted. Okay, and if you want to see where the US's interests have shifted, please read the US Defense Strategy paper. I believe it was early 2017, early on in the Trump administration, where it came out, where they said, clearly articulated that the threat emanating from the world towards the US is no more from international terrorist organizations, etc., but is emanating from Russia and China and their emerging military economic powers. Very clearly articulated. And you see US behavior, US bipartisan behavior, to now be very, very led by fear of China, okay, to an unreasonable level. And this is something which we've seen in history many, many times. Every time, when British were losing their power, you have to choose when to allow the others to emerge. I think the US is fearing emergence of China, is not willing to leave its role as the sole superpower, and that is creating interesting dynamics. I also believe that the Trump administration and the US bipartisanly is dealing with the whole China question terribly. On the JCPOA specifically, I think together with climate change, getting out the climate change agreement, and also the and another trade which now, as you see, I believe has just done with all of the Asian Pacific countries. Together with climate change, getting back, going out of climate change, this JCPOA and getting out of JCPOA was the worst thing that the Trump administration could have done, because as the Obama administration very painstakingly tried to bring Iran as part of an international player, led by the same controls, dynamics, rules that the rest of the countries are, there was a serious chance of Iran normalizing. And the US created a precedent that even a superpower's words are not to be taken seriously. So I genuinely believe that the interest is going to be very high in the Biden administration to go back to the JCPOA. I agree with some of those people who believe that the recent attack by Israel, perhaps on the nuclear scientists, is an effort to keep away the Iranians from reconsidering going back with the Americans. So it is trying to create waves of instability and chaos. So yes, a little bit of the same, but certainly with a bit of distinction, I think, the new Biden administration.
Thank you, Ms. Khar. We'll be taking a last question now, and then we'll be moving on to the closing statements for this panel discussion. The question is by Amin Shafi to Mr. Najam Sethi. And Amin wants to know that, is there a possibility of Pakistan adopting a non-alignment policy of non-alignment, since we are both closely allied to China and the USA?
Well, Pakistan has never been non-aligned. And the fact that we've just discussed how important China is, so Pakistan is going to be aligned with China and probably non-aligned with everybody else. And that's the way it's going to be. That's our requirement, and that's China's requirement. That's the region's requirement. We've actually jettisoned some of the other policies that we might not have done, but we have, like our policy with Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. I mean, it's in a total chaos right now. But having said that, I just want to take up one point about Biden and Biden's view of the world. I think, yes, Biden will focus, as far as external policy is concerned, will focus on Europe, climate change, and Iran, in that order. Iran to begin with. And I think the real challenge will be on Iran, because as Hina pointed out, the Israelis and the Saudis, etc., will want to play spoilers. And this is going to be a very interesting time to see how Biden walks the talk here. It's going to be tough. It's going to be interesting. It's going to have hiccups. So that will take up a lot of his time. Climate change is very important to him, not least because of what's happened now with COVID, all these black swans that are now coming up. And so I think, yes, he's going to work on that. He has to rebuild his relationship with Europe as well. But having said that, I think, and Pakistan is not going to figure too much in any of these foreign policy initiatives. I think the domestic issues are going to be very important for Biden. Don't forget, America is now more divided than ever before. And don't forget that President Trump is not yet through. He is now threatening to come back in 4 years' time. So I think Biden, if he wants an 8-year term and he wants to put Trumpism and everything that led to Trumpism and behind, he has to really focus on the domestic economy and society. And I think that is what is going to take up a lot of his time. America is now, as I said, in a very terrible state. And Biden will have to go beyond the rhetoric of Obama to rebuild America. So I think those are the issues that will preoccupy him now.
Thank you, Zaidi Saab. A very important question has actually popped up, and I would like to know the opinion of President Khan, and the question has come up from Mr. Shahid Shahzeb, who wants to know your opinion on the Kashmiri nationalists such as Tanveer Ahmed and other various individuals, mostly from the Kashmiri diaspora, who go out of their way to show Pakistan as being an equivalent oppressor to India in Kashmir, especially on international forums in America and Britain, which has eventually affected their stance on the Kashmir issue.
Well, our stance on Kashmir or the stance of the people of Jammu and Kashmir has not been affected by some such aberrations. As a matter of fact, let me tell you that there's this strong sentiment in Azad Kashmir and in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir for accession to Pakistan. It was there in 1947, and it has been there throughout. It is there today. And that's why you would see the martyrs in Kashmir being buried in Pakistani flag. So I think that you can't compare the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir and Azad Kashmir. Let me tell you that Azad Kashmir cannot be an equivalent of the occupied territory, because there are no killings here, there are no blindings here, no enforced disappearances, no fake encounters, no incarcerations, mass incarcerations. So this is a free land. And on the other side, you see genocide and you see war crimes being committed by the 900,000 troops. That's a prison. The people on that side of Kashmir are under siege. But at the same time, I would acknowledge that there is a pro-independence sentiment. It was there in 1947. It is still there today. But the fact is that India has banned JKLF, Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, and its supreme leader, Yasin Malik, who is in Tihar jail. And on this side, in Azad Kashmir, JKLF is free, and other pro-independence elements, they can show up at the bars, at the press clubs, they can speak in the universities. So they are not muzzled, but they're treated as traitors in the Indian occupied territory or in the entire state of Jammu and Kashmir. So what I'm saying is that we have shown a greater tolerance for dissent. So I think that it is democratic right of every citizen to express their views, but because of their views, we cannot sweep this groundswell of support for accession to Pakistan under the carpet.
Thank you, sir. We do have some time for closing statements, and I would request the panelists to not take more than 40 to 45 seconds for the closing statements. I'll start off with Ms. Hina Rabbani Khar for her closing statement.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. I think this has been an interesting panel, but I would like to say that I genuinely believe, and I think Sethi Saab possibly agreed with that, that Pakistan's foreign policy is certainly much more than its relations with the US. I believe one of the flaws in Pakistani foreign policy has been over-reliance on US to deliver on Kashmir, to deliver on our economy, to deliver on pretty much everything else. And that has kept Pakistan from delivering to itself. So I think it's time, the real focus of Pakistan's foreign policy must be on the region. And therefore, I get rather surprised when people do equate our relations with the US, which are exceptionally important, and we never want to be on the wrong side of the US. It's a superpower, you always want to be on its right side. But to equate that, or to say that it's a matter of choice between that and China, is in some ways a statement which is not really learning anything from history, because our relations with China have been and will continue to be truly strategic. And what do I mean when I say truly strategic? Truly strategic relations are relations in which you have alignment of interests, which is natural, right? So I consider those to be there with China. What we want in the region, stability, peace, is what they want. With the US, traditionally our relations have been in some ways tactical, have been based on very hollow, shallow interest, and I would hope that this cease to be the case. The US is obviously an exceptionally important country for Pakistan, but I believe, sometimes when it is said that Pakistan has to make a choice, I don't tend to agree with that. And we just hope that as we go forward, Pakistan's main issue is that Pakistan's foreign policy must always be proactive, which means Pakistan makes its own choices based on its own needs, and not only be reactive to what India is doing, or what the Afghanistan is doing, or what the US is doing, or what the UK is doing. If you have a proactive foreign policy, you make the right moves and you think long term. If you have a reactive foreign policy, you just react to short-term moves played by others.
Thank you. Sethi Saab, we'll have you next, and I think you have the floor for the next 30 seconds. And sir, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yes, okay, in 30 seconds, I'll make the following points. Number one, the US, no point in getting on the wrong side of the US, but I don't think the US is going to be on your right side, number one. Number two, so don't put your eggs in the US basket. Number two, China is very important. Fix your relationship, make it stable, make it more enduring than it is now. There are hiccups right now. Number three, don't screw around in the Gulf. Don't think that Turkey and Malaysia and Iran are as important to you as the Gulf is. The Saudi Arabians and the Gulf kingdoms are very important to you for a host of reasons, not least that they actually prop up your economy in direct and indirect ways. And I think it's important to keep that relationship going. And this business of Malaysia and Turkey, and this is neither here nor there. This is just an ego trip of the ARC Prime Minister. And thirdly, I think Afghanistan is very important and India is very important. I think there's a very palpable, real threat from India to create mischief and trouble on our border. We already know about the Indian hand in various acts of terrorism and destabilization that are taking place in Pakistan. There's no doubt about that. That is the Modi doctrine. But we need to be very, very aware and careful that if our own house is not in order, India will take advantage of it. So from there, I come to this business of getting our own house in order. We are a hugely divided country right now. I was asked the other day by a very senior military man, how do we move forward? How do we create a consensus? We can't move forward without creating a consensus. But you can't have a consensus in this country on anything now. Even the Constitution is no longer a consensus document. So my sense is we need to get our house in order. We need to realize that there are governments and there are governments in waiting. And we need to put our heads together to look at the threat that comes from India. At any stage, India could launch an adventure, small or big, and that would create enormous problems for us domestically and elsewhere.
Strategically laid out, sir, and I hope the organizations can send this, LSE Society can send a recording of this talk to the Foreign Office. We'll have the president of AJK at the now for the next 30 seconds for his closing statement. Well,
you have a very flexible definition of 30 seconds, but I'll present some one-liners. First is the Pak-United States relationship is very important within the overall framework of Pakistan's foreign policy. Second, I would say build on convergences and reduce divergences between the United States and Pakistan. And with the Biden administration, we have a new opportunity. Third, I would say that FATF and IMF and Afghanistan are all negative leverages. Try to create positive leverages. I would also like to say that we should create some sort of complementarity between the interests of the United States and Pakistan. And at the same time, we should avoid a dependency syndrome, either on the United States or on China. We will have to see whether the Biden administration would revive such initiatives as the Asia-Pacific pivot, the new Silk Road, which had been proposed by Hillary Clinton, and we will have to see what happens to the Quad. What is the future of Quad, which targeted Pakistan and China specifically? We must also realize that there is this raging arms race and three-part competition between China, United States and Russian Federation. This arms race includes nuclear weapons. So we would have to see where this race leads to. My last 2 points are that in regard to Kashmir, in the beginning, we should have low expectations from the United States leadership because they would have other priorities, Iran, Korea, or probably some of the challenges that they have. For instance, I can tell you that the day President Biden assumes his office, 2 or 3 days later, this new treaty, which is called Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, ratified by 50 countries, would come into force. That would create a new challenge, a new preoccupation for the United States and other nuclear weapon states. Last point is that for Pakistan, the most important, the most crucial challenge is its economy. If we are not economically viable, and if we do not demonstrate economic growth and development, we would always remain vulnerable, and no country on earth, including the United States and China, would be able to bail us out.
Thank you, Mr. President. With that, we will have to conclude the session. Thank you to the panelists for joining, and I will be giving the floor to Mustafa Hiraj for his final comments.
Yeah, thank you, Hamza. That was indeed a very interesting discussion and by all of our speakers. And I would like to thank individually President Sardar Masood Khan, Ms. Hina Rabbani Khar, who unfortunately had to leave because of another commitment, as well as Mr. Najam Sethi for taking out the time to attend our foreign policy panel. On that note, I would also like to point out that the end of this panel marks the conclusion of a very successful first day for the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020. We have had 3 brilliant sessions today, and I'm grateful to everyone who was in attendance. Our next panel will take place tomorrow, and that will be on the economy of Pakistan. For those of you who have registered for the conference, the link to that session should be in your emails. I realized that there was a slight issue with the Zoom links, and we received a lot of feedback on that. So we will be resending the emails to all the attendees tonight. However, the panel will once again be streamed live on our Facebook page. I guess that is it from the Foreign Policy Panel of the Future of Pakistan Conference. It was indeed a delight to host you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.